The Vine by Tennessee Williams. The woman's body beside him while he slept was something he felt with the faint and thoughtless sentience of plants to sunlight. When it was gone, when she had left the bed, he knew the same blind, formless want that plants must feel without that warmth about them. While they slept there, there was a continuity between their bodies that he had grown to depend upon. In winter, he never had quite heat enough in his own flesh. He always had to borrow a little from hers. There was always some contact between them. His knees curved into hers, his arm wrapped vine-like across her shoulders. But even when the nights were excessively warm, as they now were in the late summer, his hand or his foot must remain in touch with some part of the woman. This was essential to his feeling of security. When the contact was broken, though he didn't awake, the comfort of sleep was lost, and he turned fretfully this way and that, sometimes muttering her name aloud. Rachel. Rachel. If she was still in the room, she would return to the bed, and then, her temporary loss having stirred in him a sleepy desire, he would take her body almost as a child takes the breast of its mother, a sort of blind, instinctive, fumbling possession that hardly emerged from the state of sleep. The way that plants expand into sunlight with that sweet, thoughtless gratitude that living matter feels for what sustains its being. And so for some time now, with Rachel gone, he had slept unquietly. The cumulative, unsatisfied want drew him gradually out of sleep. His eyelids opened. Above him stretched a ceiling with a network of fine silver threads and memorized patches of brown from pipes that leaked in the rented rooms above. The square window admitted a harsh brilliance which was like the insolent stare of someone he knew despised him, but which he could not escape from. He closed his eyelids, pouted. Jesus, I feel like I've got a mouthful of old chicken feathers. Rachel said nothing. He turned and saw that her side of the bed was empty. The covers were neatly folded back, the pillows smoothed out as though she hadn't slept there at all that night. For a moment he wondered stupidly if she had. Of course. His body that had recorded like an exposed film while his mind was sleeping gave back to him now the long, sweet history of her presence near him. And then he remembered also her restless tossing which kept him awake until he complained. Rachel, why don't you lie still? And she had said, Oh my God. And he had said, What? And she had said nothing more. And he had then fallen asleep. Rachel. The emptiness of the room replied to him with a desultory drone of a large horsefly. Its wings flashed blue against the shining copper screen, as though his wife had been transformed into an insect. Slightly grinning at this fantastic notion, he pushed himself up on his elbows and squinted about. The prankish spirit of earlier years recurred sometimes in little tricks they played on each other, which made him think now that she might be hiding to tease him. But there was really not a place in the one-room apartment where a woman, even as tiny as Rachel, might conceal herself. The closet door was open. The kitchen alcove made a full confession from this angle. Grunting, he bent over, saw beneath his folding bed the pale blue garters he had lost, but not his wife. Through a series of hesitant, half-hearted movements, he got himself out of bed and over to their single window. Beyond its proscenium arch, the world was presenting another hot day's beginning. The street, which was a street in the village, was narrow and vacant. You might almost suppose that during the night a plague had wiped out the entire population. No, there was a figure. A woman, yes, but not Rachel, coming out of an areaway. He watched her pad mincingly to the delicatessen, whose windows bore a chaos of whitewashed signs and price quotations. That was very likely where Rachel had gone. An empty milk bottle and a paper bag. How much had she taken of their small cash under the Dresden doll on the bureau? He went immediately to see, recalling the precise amount there had been when they went to bed. A quarter was missing. A phone call? And a subway fare? He chuckled a little uneasily, and then there was no longer anything to postpone the dreaded approach to the mirror. In his crumpled purple pajamas with white frogs on them, he moved anxiously to that soap-splashed glass over the sink to make the morning analysis of his looks. In his youth, he had been very handsome indeed, an ideal juvenile type, and even at 43, not having permitted himself to exceed a 10-pound concession to middle years, he still had a fairly comfortable sense of being attractive. Ah, but his hair. They said it stopped thinning at 40, and if you got it that far, you had it for keeps. How true was this notion? He inclined his head as low as he could and still see into the glass. The crown was becoming more visible every day. Yes, blooming forth pink as a rose. Oh well. It was also said that thinning hair was a sign of superior male vigor. That could be. It cost him nothing to think so. Automatically, he began to rotate his scalp beneath the close grip of 10 fingers, halting at the count of 60 with a breathless grunt of relief. That completed, he went back to the window. He reached it just in time to see the spinsterish woman who had gone into the delicatessen coming back out of it, bearing her package clasped tight against her flat bosom, as though afraid that someone would snatch it from her. Have you ever noticed, he inquired of himself, how tightly anxious people hold on to things such as hat brims while waiting in managers' offices? Huh. Yesterday, when he walked out of McClintock's, his Panama was so dented it had to be reblocked. Oh yes. Now he knew what he had to do this morning. Call Edie Van Cleve about that part in the road company of Violets Are Blue. He took a dime and descended in his bathrobe to the downstairs hall. Your reading was fine, she told him, but Mr. Davidson feels you're a shade too young for the part. Going back up the stairs, his heart jolted strangely. A palpitation. He had them off and on. The doctor had told him there was nothing organically wrong, no pathological lesion. If you took your heart out, said the doctor, you would find that it looked exactly like a normal heart, only a little overdeveloped because of the strenuous life that you've been leading. This statement was meant to be reassuring, more so than Donald had found it. What strenuous life? He had never overextended himself at work or at play. Rehearsals could be a strain, but he always felt fine while working. It was only during the last 2 or 3 years that held these long periods of unwanted inaction that he had begun to decline from the pink of condition. Steps in the hall. Rachel? No. They continued upstairs. He began to curse her, teasingly, as though she could hear him. his eyes fixed on the framed photograph of the glowworm ballet, girls in shimmering tutus going through some intricate dance routine. They had held tiny flashlights that winked off and on in the stage's rosy dusk. At the end of the line was Rachel, a shade smaller, quicker, and more graceful than the others. His act had followed hers. He was the straight man in a vulgar dialogue with a comedian now dead of heart disease, Tommy Watson. Huh. There was Tommy's picture. Kind of nice not having to compare it with the way he looked now. And there was his own picture in a straw hat and a bow tie. Not much older than his son would now be. But they had not had any children, he and Rachel. They had scrupulously avoided the chance of any for about 10 years. And then one summer, about 3 years ago, Rachel had grown pensive. He couldn't snap her out of it. They were playing in summer stock. All at once, Rachel had started looking her age, and the manager said, "I'm sorry, but we can't light her anymore for ingenue parts. And we've got all the character women that we can use." That was a horrible thing. Rachel went around looking half-conscious for a number of days. And then one night she said, "I want a baby." He demurred a little, but she was persistent. "We've got to have a baby." They stopped the preventive devices and waited 6 months. And when it still didn't happen, they went to a doctor. Both were thoroughly examined, and at the end, the doctor talked to Rachel. Donald waited nervously outside. When she came out, she looked at him sort of oddly. "What did he say?" "He says we can't have children." "There's something wrong with you, honey?" "Not with me," she told him. "He says you're sterile." This had struck Donald a nasty blow where it hurts a man most. The many flattering attentions which he had received in his youth had inflated his sexual vanity, and it had never retracted to normal size. On the way home from the doctor's, he had been flushed and silent. At last, he said huskily, "Rachel?" "Yes?" "Don't let anyone know." "Don't be silly, Donald. It's nothing to be ashamed of. But why advertise it?" "Exactly." But their relations had been altered by the discovery. They laughed to think what trouble they had taken all those years to avoid something that couldn't have happened. But the joke was on Donald, really, and it was hard to accept for that reason. For a while, the psychic trauma was so acute that he found it difficult to make love to Rachel. But Rachel understood it better than he. She won him tenderly back, and gradually the humiliation faded from his mind, and things became almost the same as they had been before. Donald was not inclined to keep old hurts alive, and if Rachel was still brooding about her disappointment, she wore no outward sign of it. Donald got a fairly good part in a show that ran 9 months in New York, and they saved a bit of money. When it went on the road, it perished under Claudia Cassidy's incorruptible justice in Chicago. Since that engagement, Donald had had nothing but TV, and not much of that. Donald had once read somewhere that the way to combat a feeling of depression was to take unusual pains with your appearance. "Dress your blues away" was the stimulating title of this column of advice. He remembered having read it aloud to Rachel during a time when she seemed to be giving in to her moods. It had been addressed to female readers, but there was nothing about the theory that was not adaptable to a youngish, middle-aged man who took a better-than-normal pride in presenting a good appearance. And so he took out Rachel's manicure set and cleaned and trimmed and polished his nails. He powdered his plumpish body with lilac talcum and applied cologne to his armpits, donned a fresh pair of faintly pink-tinted nylon boxer shorts, and removed from its laundryman's sheath one of a pair of snow-white linen suits that he had been husbanding all summer against some days of importance that hadn't arrived. "I've never known a man that looks as good as you in white linen," someone had said to him once. But that was in another country, and the wench was dead. For when he actually caught a full-length view of himself outside, on the dazzlingly unreal streets, in one of those sudden mirrors sandwiched between shop windows, he saw that the tightness which he felt in the linen, and which he thought might be attributable only to its laundered crispness, was indisputably owing to the expansion about his middle. He tried unbuttoning the jacket. This felt better. But when he passed another sidewalk mirror, he noticed that the starched jacket now flared behind him in a way that made him look like a bantam rooster, strutting along the street in snowy feathers. It took no more than this to undo all he had done to dress away his blues. And he continued aimlessly through noonday brilliance, through crowds that all seemed to have appointments to keep, definite places to go. He noticed that no one seemed to be looking at him, and this was something that he had never noticed before, and he tried deliberately to catch the eyes of people moving in the opposite stream on the walk. He slowed his walk and stared hard into faces looming toward him, not only the faces of pretty girls tripping out for lunch hour, but faces of women of his own generation. And with mounting dismay, a feeling close to a beginning of panic, he failed to hold their attention for more than a second. And one girl, as she passed him, uttered a startled laugh. Not necessarily at him, but if not at him, at what? She was walking alone. He turned directly after this experience into a drugstore and ordered a bicarbonate of soda, which he seized the instant the boy at the counter released it, and drained it down without pause. Ah, that did relieve the gaseous compression which he felt under his heart, and that irritable organ seemed to beat more evenly than it had on the street. "The city is full," he said to himself, "of people that talk and laugh to themselves on the street. It is full of completely self-centered people capable only of seeing themselves in mirrors. And even if strangers don't gaze at you on the sidewalk as they once did, a summer or two gone by, that means only what?" He failed to complete the reflection, having observed that the stool next to his at the soda fountain was now occupied by a girl, whom he judged to be a young stenographer having her midday Coke. She was probably dieting to keep her hips down. Yes. They lapped somewhat over the chromium periphery of the stool, somewhat overhanging it like the hood of a mushroom. Yes, he murmured encouragingly to himself, as he met her eyes in the mirror at the moment when his fingers, the knuckles of his right hand, came gently into contact with her left buttock and gave it a couple of slight nudges. Her eyes blinked, and then she continued to sip her Coke without smiling or turning toward him. The blink and the unchanged expression were an equivocal reaction, and so he tried it once more. The woman did not turn toward him. There was still no change in her expression, but she began to speak to him in a low, rapid voice like the buzz of a swarm of stinging insects. He preferred not to hear what she was saying to him, and he got up with a rapidity that made his head swim and charged out the door. He consoled himself, or tried to console himself, with the observation that the village now was overrun with women who hated men. He knew not where he was going, but he was headed toward Washington Square. Whew. He stopped. He was in front of the Whitney Museum. Boom, 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 went that abused organ, his heart. Abused by what? Tensions of his profession, said the doctor. Boom, boom, boom. In front of the museum was a cheerfully colored poster advertising a showing of non-objective paintings. Rachel. What she had probably left somewhere in their room was a little note explaining that she had gone to spend the day with one of her girlfriends, perhaps with Jane Austen, the one that lived uptown on Columbus Circle, one that was equally friendly to them both. Well, a pair of youngsters, a boy and a girl of the long-haired village crowd, came up alongside him and also stared at the poster. And he moved over a little, respectfully, to hear their comments. He recognized the name Mondrian as one he had heard before, but the reproduction was still meaningless to him as a strip of linoleum in a clean, bright kitchen. There was a whole world of such things to which he had no entrance, and though he was vain, he was humble at heart, and never sucked at enthusiasms to which he was an outsider. He stood there respectfully listening to the young couple's comments, and then, God help him, the bicarb erupted in a belch so loud that the kids turned and burst into giggles. He wasn't yet recovered from his light-headed spell, but had to move on. Arrived at the square, he caught a Fifth Avenue bus to Jane Austen's apartment, but there was no upper deck, and it seemed to him, with disturbing vagueness, that maybe it had been a long time since there had been open-deck buses on Fifth Avenue. He couldn't remember if they still had them or not, and thoughts trailed off without distinct ends or beginnings. Jane was at home with a white cloth tied about her somewhat large-featured head, which looked startled at him when she opened the door. Her greeting was an odd one. She said, "Get you!" And though he supposed it was an allusion to the white linen suit and mermaid-figured pale blue and white silk tie, it wasn't as pleasant and warm a greeting as a caller might hope for. "Rachel here?" he demanded heartily. "Why, no. Should she be here?" "Well, I thought maybe. I haven't seen you or Rachel since that party in June." He thought there was something a little too clipped and short-winded in her speech, and she didn't even apologize for her appearance. Evidently, she had not suffered from depression that morning, or if she had certainly no faith in the dress your blues away theory. But to give the devil her due, she was at least making some efforts to clean up the mess and disorder remaining from what must have been a very large party last night, to which, for some reason, she had omitted to ask them. But then New York is a place where everybody knows too many people. He waited a moment for Jane to say, "Sit down." And since she didn't, he walked casually past her and settled himself on the sofa. He thought about the party last month, wondering if it contained some clue to Jane's altered attitude toward him. There had been a good deal of indiscriminate lechery, the sort of thing that Rachel never took part in, but which he sometimes did. No more seriously than a man might join a bunch of kids playing baseball. Rachel had left early with a married couple, but he had stayed on. He remembered now that he and Jane and some other person had drifted into the bedroom, and there had been some rather involved goings-on, in the course of which someone had gotten sore at someone and made a scene. He didn't remember about what or how it turned out, except that he left soon after and stayed in a bar till it closed. Maybe the fight had been more serious than he recalled it having been. That would explain why Jane was behaving so coldly. "Rachel has disappeared," he said to Jane. "When?" "This morning." "Did she?" Her manner expressed no interest. The room was filled with the musty flavor of dusk and heat and liquor and stale tobacco. He waited for Jane to offer him a drink. He saw at least one bottle of Haig and Haig, which had several fingers of liquor still left in it. But Jane was being obtuse. She leaned on the handle of the vacuum with a slight frown and a faraway look. She lived by herself in this unpleasantly bright apartment. Donald could never quite imagine people living alone. It seemed less conceivable somehow than life on the moon. How did they get up in the morning? How do they know when to eat? Or where or how do they make up their minds about any of the little problems of existence? When you came home alone after being alone on the street, how was it bearable not having someone to tell all the little things you had on your mind? When you really thought about it, when you got down to it, what was there to live for outside of all-encompassing and protecting intimacy of marriage? And yet a great many women like Jane Austen got on without it. There were also men who got on without it. But he could not think of it. Going to bed alone? The wall on one side of you? Empty space on the other? No warmth but your own? No flesh in contact with yours? Such loneliness was indecent. No wonder people who lived in those obscenely solitary lives did things while sober that you only did when drunk. He looked at Jane and felt kind of sorry for her, although she was certainly not being very nice to him today. Well, she probably felt a little neglected. He should have called her or made some further advances after those blurred goings-on in the bedroom that night. His ears were abruptly assailed by the renewed whine of the vacuum cleaner. "Jane! Excuse me just a few minutes. I'm expecting company, and I've got things to write up a little." She gave him a quick, hard smile as she pushed the infernal apparatus across the floor. The odor became more and more nauseating. He raised his legs from the floor and stretched full length on the sofa. This sort of treatment he certainly would not put up with. "Jane! Jane!" She turned off the cleaner. "What is it?" "I'm feeling lonesome," he said. "Are you?" "Jane, don't you ever feel lonesome?" "Never." "Why don't you settle down, Jane?" "What do you mean?" "Get married." "Ha!" She started to turn on the vacuum. He grabbed it from her and rested his chin on the handle. She put her hands on her hips and stared at him so uncordially that he was almost intimidated. "Where do you think Rachel is?" "Worried about her?" "Oh no," he laughed. "I'm not optimistic enough to think she's gone for good." Jane did not smile nor even glance at him again. She pushed the cleaner into a closet and began pounding the silk pillows into shape. She tugged at the corner of the one on which he was resting. This was intolerable. He grabbed her by both shoulders and jerked her down on top of him and squashed his mouth against hers. He tried to force her lips open, at the same time pushing his hands down her back. All at once he felt a terrific blow on the side of his head. It stunned him. Green light flashed in his eyes, and there was a sickening spasm in his stomach. He leaned over the edge of the sofa, and that bicarbonate of soda he had had at the drugstore spilled into an inadequate cup of his hands. He wiped them stupidly on his handkerchief. "What did you hit me with?" It was an unnecessary question. On the floor were shattered bits of blue pottery which he remembered seeing in the shape of a vase that contained a pair of sunflowers. "You might have killed me with that," he said to her sadly. She was standing over him, panting, and the disgust on her face was completely unfeigned. "You make me sick," she said. "Now please get out." The room had not changed in his absence. Only the light shone through a different window. The light was different. While he was gone upon his unhappy excursion about the city, the light in the room had performed the circuit of a lifetime, from violence to exhaustion. It did not stare at him nor make any harsh demands. It stayed near the window in a golden blur. The horsefly had also moved to that other window and showed a recession of power. Against the exterior light, its delicate wings still glinted as points of blue flame. But the furious dives at the screen were now interspersed with periods of reflection, which seemed to admit that failure was not any longer the least imaginable of all eventualities. Donald crossed immediately to the screen and gently unlatched it to let the fly out. He did this rather silly thing unconsciously, just as he opened doors for cats or children. He was a very kind man. There was something soft and passive about his mind which made it unusually responsive to the problems of creatures smaller or even weaker than himself. He stood a while at the window. What was it this moment was trying to make him remember? Oh my God. Yes, that long ago play he was in. That was his first acting job. He played the part of an adolescent coal miner who was killed in the collapse of a shaft. His mother was played by that old bitch Florence Kerwin. At the last curtain, she slowly advanced to a window flooded with yellow gelatin and said in a tremulous whisper, "All sunsets are remembrance." There was a count of 5 and a very slow curtain. Before the curtain was down, the seats were banging up, and the little patter of applause was drowned in the shuffle of feet. The mysterious little Alabama spinster who wrote the play was standing breathlessly beside him in the wings as old Florence Kerwin came off. The actress glanced at them both and shouted, "The play is a turkey." The manager was standing there too, and the spinster author turned to him uncomprehendingly. "What is a turkey?" she asked. "A bird with feathers," he told her. Donald had put his arms about her shoulders as she began to cry. Those tears that innocence is bathed in when it blunders trustfully into the glittering microcosm of Broadway. And over the quivering shoulders of Miss Charlotte something or other, who never was heard of again, he could see the coldly furious little manager tackling the closing notice upon the board. Now Donald began to look around for the note Rachel must have left to explain her very long absence. He looked everywhere that a note might conceivably be left, even under the bed, and the stove in case it had blown to the floor. At last he opened the closet where Rachel kept her clothes. Then, for the second time that afternoon, he received a blow that all but cracked his skull. Her clothes were gone from the closet. Her suitcase was also gone. Almost nothing remained but empty hangers. Rachel is not coming back. Until his blurred sight focused, he moved toward the wall where, against her protests, He kept the picture of Rachel as a glowworm. On her lips was the gay, artificial smile of show business. The spangled tutu was lifted to show her bare thighs. Her bosom was visible through the sheer band of chiffon. No one had ever had such a lovely bosom as Rachel still had. But then, in just a few moments, the curtain of the finale would be coming down, and they would go out to eat, and then home to bed. In the hotel room, a shade would be lowered for the beginning of something instead of the end. Oh God, what pleasure those early nights had contained. Things that couldn't even be said with music. Wasn't it natural to be vain in those days? It wasn't ridiculous to be vain in those days, both of them young and both of them lovely then. Coming together with such a crazed abandon that daylight would crowd the windows before their hands and arms and mouths would begin to let go of each other. Then they would go out to breakfast without having slept. No stockings on Rachel. He without socks or tie. And gorged themselves, hungry as wolves, on bowls of steaming cereal and cups of sweet black coffee, and platters of bacon and eggs. What did they say to each other? It didn't seem that they ever talked to each other. He couldn't remember conversations between them. It was all longing and satisfaction of longing. They helped each other undress when they had returned from breakfast. Gently, each took the other's shoes off, and they fell in the bed like a pair of rag dolls a child dropped there, their bodies athwart each other in silly positions. So much light in the room for people to sleep in, but not enough to take much longer. Oh, Rachel, where have you gone? No other refuge was thinkable but sleep. So he went to bed and lifelessly took off his clothes. Under the covers, he doubled his body up in a round embryonic position. He closed his teeth on a corner of the pillow, the one that was hers, and began to release his tears. Rachel, Rachel, oh Rachel. Then all at once he heard her returning footsteps. All in a rush of calling and sobbing, she entered. Before he could lift his shoulders from the bed, she had fallen upon him. She tore back the covers and scalded his face with her tears. Her cheekbones were awfully sharp. There was so little flesh on her arms. They were actually skinny, and yet they embraced him so fiercely he couldn't breathe. Oh, Rachel, he sobbed. And she moaned, Donald, Donald. The name of a person you love is more than language. But after a while, when their sobbing had quieted a little, he held her fiery head in the crook of his arm and began to recite the litany of his sorrows. He told her about his misfortunes, the ones of this day and the probable ones of tomorrow. He told her about his illness, his palpitations, his possible death before long. He told her his beauty was lost. His time was now past. He had not been given that part he had counted upon. Strangers had laughed at him on the street, and Jane had misunderstood him. She had struck him over the head with a piece of blue pottery that might have killed him. And Rachel, whose sorrows were scarcely less than his own, said nothing about them, but set her lips on his throat and answered with infinite softness to everything that he told her. I know. I know. 1944, published 1954.